Hello, and welcome to another session on deploying Microsoft Azure Stack. My name is Mark Grimes, and I'll be presenting this session. In this session in particular, we will talk about installing the Azure Stack Development Kit, or ASDK, as it's commonly referred to. All the documentation can be found at this at a very simple URL, aka.ms/ASDK. Also, I'll remind you of this again later on, but Matt McSpirit, one of our global black belts, has a most excellent GitHub repository that has some scripts you definitely will want to take advantage of if you're going to deploy and use the ASDK. We'll talk more about those and the details later on. In our agenda, what we're going to look at are the who, what, where, when, and why we would use this. We'll take a look at the Azure Stack Development Kit architecture and what it is and what it isn't. And then finally, we'll drill down into deployment for the various tasks, requirements, the references, and exploring it with first tasks, things that you can do and try. Azure Stack Development Kit overview. Let's take a look at this. What we've learned from our customers, we've done lots of surveys in various programs inside of Microsoft with customers that have been trying and deploying and using Azure Stack. What we found out is that 75% of our customers expect to deploy their first instance of Azure Stack shortly after general availability. And this has been a while now, but this is what we hear from our customers and have seen in the past. Greater than 50% are delivering solutions as server-based application VMs hosted on existing private cloud environments. For me personally, I visited many customers around the world, and I find out that they have virtualization solutions, whether on Hyper-V or VMware, and they're looking for various reasons to move off of those. One of the biggest reasons that I've seen is that in addition to all the things that they have to do to maintain and patch and update all the underlying infrastructure for those Hyper-V or VMware environments, they're looking to get into a more agile process, and they're hearing it from their customers. A few of my larger CSPs or cloud solution providers have indicated that their customers are saying, we want to have cloud native solutions, but yet we want to have it local or near to us so we can maybe see and feel it and touch it in your data center. So a lot of these customers that may not be really close to an Azure data center, but they're maybe a little bit more remote, or in some instances of my customers, they've been in geographic locations where the data had to reside there. As an example is New Zealand. New Zealand seems to be somewhat close to Australia, but there's actually quite a bit of latency, and in my customer there in particular, they had to have the data resident in New Zealand, whether or not they had an Azure data center or not, which they didn't in New Zealand. And it also, there is a little bit of latency as well. So these are some of the things that we've talked about in the earlier sessions as to why Azure Stack. Those are two really big reasons that customers ask for it. So why should you care? It helps you to hit the ground running. It's very simple. When I started personally looking and testing with Azure Stack, I went to some of the Microsoft Technology Centers because I had friends there, and they all were doing the same thing. So before they got their integrated systems, they had Azure Stack Development Kits. I went alongside, helped to deploy it, watched the process, realized how quick and simple it was compared to a large integrated system. And then once that's deployed, you can really kick the tires and get a feel for how everything works. And the great thing is that the ASDKs are kept up to date with the Azure Stack integrated systems as well as far as the release versions. You can understand impacts on IT service delivery. So you can build these things out, run them, see what the process is involved. look at the requirements from the application side of the house, determine what their needs are, and you can actually test this out. In one large instance where we were doing a POC of this, we were waiting for the vendors to align up their delivery dates and schedule their people, and we wanted to get things moved along the applications. So what Microsoft's development team did to support this customer was they actually built out their applications in an ASDK and made it in a CI/CD pipeline. So by the time that we did get the Azure Stack integrated system ready, and I helped to deploy the resource providers and download all the marketplace images, their part was really already done because they had built it, they tested it, they designed it inside the ASDK. Then we just ran that pipeline and it had injected it in just a matter of hours. So again, showing the agility that we can do when we're deploying and getting ready before we get to the actual production system without doing any harm to any production system. Prepare your IT teams. This is something that I see and have seen time and time again when I visit lots of customers around the world. Sometimes customers, they study and they'll do the exams and everything, but they didn't actually have a system. As we know, documentation is pretty darn good, but there's nothing like getting on the system, kicking the tires and seeing what works and doesn't work, and trying to do proof of concepts with your various systems. So planning early will give you more time to prepare your IT teams for the adoption of completely new operating models and will accelerate their ability to properly operate and optimize these new technologies and models they enabled. Another thing related to that I see at customers, and this depends on your experience as well, organizations that have little to no general cloud experience, whether in Azure or other clouds, this is another learning curve. So if you are really familiar and strong with Azure, there are some things that will be familiar and easier, but in probably half the cases, or maybe a little bit less or more, I'm not sure exactly, but I find a lot of customers, they go through the Azure Stack Operator experience, they learn and figure that out, but then they make the offers, plans, quotas, the users get a subscription, and now the users are in this subscription and maybe they have no experience. So now you've got another side of the coin that the Azure Stack Operator or someone within your organization has to help those folks out with. So if they don't have the experience, then we talked about in the marketplace session about how you can create custom solution templates, whether you have the experience or get some from the marketplace, or you work with an ISV to help reduce and ease their pain. But so it's all these things can be tested inside an ASDK, just like in an Azure Stack integrated system where I have an Azure Stack Operator portal and a user/tenant portal. I can do all that testing. And the IT teams, even if they're just playing Azure Stack Operator, they're probably going to have to get in at some point whether or not you have ownership of those user subscriptions or not. You may have to hook up monitoring equipment, or you may want to have read capabilities inside of those user subscriptions. So again, all of this can be tested inside of the ASDK. Experience new capabilities in a dev environment. So with an ASDK, we can take advantage of hands-on experience in a development environment running on Microsoft infrastructure to experience the power of solutions for yourself before investing in the platform. So maybe the decision hasn't been made quite yet. And as I did a session internally at Microsoft, we like to think this is the perfect solution, but everything is a right fit. Sometimes Azure Stack is the right solution. Sometimes Azure's the right solution. Sometimes maybe Databox Edge is the right solution. So these things need to be evaluated. And this is a low-cost, low-hanging fruit where you can test this out to make sure it does work for you properly. And if it does, great, move on. If not, then you can look at and consider and do proof of concepts with other intelligent edge options. So who should be interested? It's targeted for the following. If you watch the earlier sessions on Azure Stack, the message that we always talk about is an Azure consistent cloud experience. So again, if you've got that kind of experience, it's going to be a little bit easier and less painful for you to move into this. The only delta, the big delta, is that if you're very familiar with Azure, you understand all the Azure resources and objects and permissions, etc., that you do to deploy an environment in Azure. The learning curve then, which you could learn on an ASDK, is the back-end side, in other words, the Azure Stack operator space, which is in the public cloud what Microsoft does and that what people don't see. So again, from my experience, it's been pretty enlightening having worked with an Azure Stack development kit as well as an integrated system. I really have a better understanding of how Azure works in some ways. So that's getting that consistent cloud experience and the background and knowing how to provide those resources as an Azure Stack operator. You can do that all in ASDK. Demonstrating Azure Stack and services and applications. So this is a great way to test. I gave the example about the customer where before we went to an integrated system, we were waiting for all the times for the deployment and the installation configuration, and our development team had it already done. If you're thinking about some of the solutions that we talked about in the marketplace session, which is, as we mentioned, to reduce the pain, this is where you can try these out. And then once you have those templates that you develop in Azure Stack Development Kit will easily port over and can be brought into with those same scripts from ASDK into your Azure Stack integrated system. Also, if you have customers that you are using Azure Stack with and also have Azure Cloud applications, you can demonstrate and test those hybrid cloud scenarios too. So under documentation, we've done a really great job of looking at the themes and variations of how you might have some things in the Azure public cloud versus, or even government cloud for that matter, or some things on Azure Stack. And again, we could test this out in an ASDK. So we talked about all this is about kicking the tires of Azure and Azure Stack production for dev and test, developing hybrid modern applications. We just talked about that. And also the cloud administrator for Azure Stack. So we've talked about role-based access controls and cloud admins in various sessions that we've had on this. But the cloud administrator actually has some very specific things they're responsible for, which may or may not be the same activities if you have separation of duties for these versus Azure Stack operator who may be the owner of the default tenant subscription for the Azure Stack administration portal. So that's a great way to do that. And another side benefit too, if you and or your team wanted to get the Azure Stack certification, you could test and try out all the things that are in the ASDK, again, without having the high cost of an integrated system if you haven't got that yet. Of course, if you have it, it's great to do it there, but again, this is a can do no harm space that's not production, and it's not intended for production either. So what were we thinking when we made the development kit? What's the idea behind this? Well, obviously, as we said, it's low cost. It's limited deployment duration. It's literally hours instead of days, maybe. And not that we're saying an Azure Stack integrated system take days, but when you look at the two parts of an OEM coming in, which was first the hardware validation, then second the Azure Stack Fabric deployment. Once that's done, then the Azure Stack operator takes over and they install their images. They are going to put resource providers. They're going to download marketplace. That can take several days. So to get a fully integrated system up and running to where you can really deploy workloads on there, particularly when you have zero experience. If you've done it over and over again, you have multiple stacks, you can shrink that time down, but it's still going to be days. This you can get in hours. And the MATMXSpirit script I showed at the beginning is one way to accelerate that. So you can deploy it pretty rapidly with a deployment script. We'll get to that one in a little bit, which gets the core services up and running. And then to do everything else, to see how everything works, MATMXSpirit script installs the rest of the stuff, which is really, really cool. There's minimal hardware required. It's not a multi-node system. It's not a rack. It's one server, and we'll cover the minimum and recommended requirements for that coming up soon. It's reduced component install. So again, it's not production. We don't have to have high availability. We don't have to have dual power supplies. If you want to, you could, but it's not required. It's easy to install. It's all done through PowerShell, as well as MATMXSpirit's script does the same thing. It can integrate into a larger environment and enables on-premises Azure modern application development. So where can it be deployed? Well, the idea is that anything that meets or exceeds the minimum or recommended hardware requirements should work. And of course, the more hardware you give it, the better the experience. More virtual machines, faster storage, faster networks, etc. Early on, back in the early days, a couple years ago, when I went out to customers and they followed the guidelines, they did the minimum requirements, and then they started just putting everything on it. And what happened? They became disappointed because it would run really, really slow. So we said, look, minimum is minimum. Pretty much just get you up and running. You want to do the recommended or a little bit more if you can afford and find the hardware. Even in Microsoft, we've set up labs for our own testing where we found server hardware lying around that we were able to leverage. And sometimes even IT shops have that server that just is not being used by someone, and you can repurpose it. So try to look for that sort of stuff. And then beef it up a little bit more, particularly with regards to the memory and hard disk. The development kit is assumed to have unfettered network access to the internet. So from a minimum requirements, we'll cover the details of this, but make sure you have the minimum storage, network, and memory. There's a pre-checker. We'll do a quick demonstration of that you can run. And there's the link at the bottom that will tell you about everything you want to know about Azure Stack Deploy. One thing I do want to note that they've changed recently over the way it used to be, but in the Azure Stack documentation, there is actually an entire kind of separate section which is everything you want to know about ASDK. So it's the Azure Stack documentation is kind of broken down into three parts. There is the Azure Stack operator documentation. There's another whole section, which is the Azure Stack user or tenant documentation, which is great for both you to learn and know, as well as to show and educate to your customers, whether they're internal or external. And then the third part of the Azure Stack documentation is everything you want to know about the ASDK. So Azure Stack Dev Kit's been available for a long time. Again, we're way past these GA proof of concept times. But the key point here to note is that it's an offering that has monthly updates in sync with the full Azure Stack integrated system patch and update cycle. So going back to the documentation, one thing I wanted to mention, and again, I think it's been pretty much fixed. I haven't gone through all the docs, but the fact that we have an entire separate section just for ASDK, that's fantastic. When you go to the Azure Stack operator documentation, sometimes you will see notes. It will say Azure Stack Integrated System only, or Azure Stack Integrated System and ASDK. So that's the only thing I just want you to be careful about. If you ever see something that says Azure Stack Integrated System only, and maybe it's an Azure Stack operator responsibility, well, then it's just for that. Most things that I can think of off the top of my head will probably cover both, but sometimes you'll see a little bit of documentation that will point that out. Also, just as a side note, if you look at taking the exam for certification, Sometimes they'll ask you about ASDK, the Azure Stack Development Kit versus Azure Stack Integrated System. So it's important to know those if you decide to go down that path. And again, another thing about the offering we've talked about, you can model the applications and solutions with minimal investment. I've known several consultants that have gone out and sourced out parts for a server, and for less than the price of a good laptop, most people are able to put this together. So let's see what we haven't covered here. I think we've covered a lot of this as far as the minimum scale, repeatability of development experience prior to or alongside Azure Stack production deployments. And I think it's not only that before, but once we have an Azure Stack deployment, and then we want to try things out before we go to the next version. And a great example is some people are concerned about, or they ask, should I keep my Azure Stack at the latest version? So there's lots of different theories on that. I'm not going to go down that road, but let's say if you believed in N-1 and you like to keep production one behind, well, maybe you could have an ASDK that is at N version. So before we click the button to update, unpatch our entire Azure Stack production system, we could have a CI/CD pipeline, deploy those applications and test those things in an ASDK with the latest build. Once it's good, then we can update the production system as well. Just an option. I'm not saying that's the best thing to do, but it's a good use case of using an ASDK. Simplicity, again, ease and speed of redeployment for the ASDK. Again, the big caveat, though, would be to make sure that anything you have installed in there you have in an automated process, unless it's relatively simple. For example, if you're just doing the templates that are in the marketplace, or if you're just doing the virtual machines. Now, here's an interesting note that you would want to keep those stored. We've talked about templates in some of our other sessions about storing them as code. So you'd want to have those in a central repository where you could access those, maybe in a GitHub repository, right? So that you could pull those down every time that you redo this. As a real world example of a way not to do this, one of my customers, they were running and testing. They had an entire team on one application, and I went and asked them what version. And this was just recently here in 2019. And they said their ASDK was version 1811, which is way a lot of dog years ago, just a couple years ago, but very, very old. And I said, why haven't you updated? And they said, because they don't want to break all the application development that's been done in there. They didn't automate it. They didn't make a CI/CD pipeline. So that's a lesson learned. You don't want that to happen, particularly if you have some sort of large complex application. Because then you lose all the benefits of things we're talking about, where you could keep updating this and seeing, does that big complex application run nicely and efficiently in my latest version of Azure Stack? If so, then we know we're good to go. Flexibility, low cost, low overhead. And hey, what about this? We could actually have multiple ASDKs for multiple people to do this, multiple teams. Maybe we want to separate out dev, test, and QA, and they each could have their own Azure Stack development kit. Possibilities there. So things to think about. It's really a great testing proving ground for all these things. So why is the development kit important? A lot of it, particularly again, this is, put a little caveat here. This is, for those who haven't moved into the cloud, aren't familiar with those. I think there's a couple pain points, or we'll say learning opportunities. Let's look at it that way. So when customers come from traditional Hyper-V or VMware environments, those traditional storage and networking solutions work one way, but when we get to the Azure Stack world, we're now in software-defined networking and storage models that are going to change everything. It's going to be a paradigm shift for those folks. They're not going to have all the knobs and triggers to tweak and adjust like they've been able to do. And to them, they feel like this is something not so good. But the thing they have to realize is it's a purpose-built infrastructure, and software-defined networking and software-defined storage is the model of the cloud. And they need to get away from all the tweaks and knobs because, as we know, it's a sealed black box under the hood. They can't get in there and do those. Now, there are other things, particularly in virtual networks, which we'll have a session on that they do need to know and understand. So, for example, how to build out and carve out virtual networks, subnetworks, network storage groups, user-defined routes or routing tables, maybe integrating in, particularly when we get integrated systems, it could be network virtual appliances. So those are things, and then also learning how to do this in templates. So for most people, again, if you haven't been in Azure, a lot of people aren't familiar with ARM templates, and this is the way we deploy things. This is how a lot of the solutions exist out on the GitHub Quick Start templates. So these are new skills that people have to learn. And I tell my customers whenever they bark about that, I go, look, we're in IT, folks. The only thing constant in IT is change. And this is a good change because there's less that you're burdened with all the traditional networking and storage. And now you can get on to higher order, higher value, quicker to production, quicker to test dev, QA, and then quicker to service your customers. So it's all good. Workload composition. So customers are going to need to review current workload architectural models, determine how faster standardized design and deployment cycles will affect your application and data platforms. So we can have all those cool CI/CD pipelines and dev automation, DevOps sec, all that sort of stuff. But if your application hasn't been updated yet and isn't modernized, it may or may not work so smoothly. But again, in the ASDK, we can test this out and flush everything out. Workload management. Azure Stack will enable customers to adopt a technology lifecycle model that moves at the speed of public cloud releases. And if your organization is still in the traditional waterfall method of deployment, this is something that really should be changing, just like the industry is. In most of the larger, more progressive organizations I've worked with, as well as what I hear through other consultants, most people are looking at an agile methodology, working in sprints and getting things out to production much faster. And as you've seen, Microsoft has done this ourselves. It used to be we'd test, build, and deploy and ship out something and say, we'll see you back in 3 years. But now things happen on, a very, very fast cadence, and things will come out iteratively, and then even our major updates are done fairly quickly. So it's because Azure Stack is on that similar cadence to updates at the speed the way Azure does. This is the way that we need to adopt our organization also to be ready to move at the speed of cloud. Operations. Azure Stack will introduce new operational processes, service models, and oversight that can help your teams make the most of your deployment from the start. So there are some simple metrics and dashboards in there, but you also have the ability to query and extract more detailed information through accessing the APIs. So one of the things that we have that you can see what it looks like is in GitHub, we have something known as the CCO dashboard for public Azure. And you could also do something similar to that. So what it does, it takes Power BI, it accesses whatever, various metrics, and you can see examples of that at the CCO dashboard in GitHub. And it will display those nice little KPI dashboards. You can do the same thing in Azure Stack. So if you had the skills, you could work that out. If not, we at Microsoft actually have an internal offering that we can do that as well. So again, it's a kind of a new way of displaying, showing these metrics for new operational processes. So I think we've covered this pretty well, but let's just reiterate here when to use what. Azure Stack Development Kit, or the SDK, It helps for education on Azure Stack administration and application solution development validation. Get the experience, the hands-on that they need. I've gone to customer sites and done training for large groups of users, but they are told they can't do anything on their production system because they don't want to break anything, and they didn't have an ASDK. So I say, you need to get an ASDK because this is the way your admins can test. And if you have everything else scripted out, it doesn't matter if you break it. You can rerun the script, rewipe it, it's brand spanking new. So it's a great education and testing proving ground for your administrators. And you could even say it's not just for admins, right? You can have, if you had internal customers or you brought in external customers, you could have them create and deploy and test their solutions. Once you've built up the resource providers and templates and virtual images, they could then test the user space just like Microsoft's developers did in my customer scenario I talked about, where they built out a CI/CD dev test environment and got it perfected. And then when we were ready to go to production, that was the fastest, simplest part of it, getting those applications. The harder part was getting all the post installations set up for the Azure Stack Integrate system for the resource providers, templates, images, all that sort of stuff. So it's not just for the Azure Stack operators. You could actually have the dev test teams in the user space, tenant space, as well as possible customers. Particularly if they're internal, it's going to be a lot easier. So on the Azure Stack OEM integrated system, this is scale testing. Now, we're using the word testing, but we've been talking about production. I've seen some customers, particularly larger CSPs, what they will do is buy a smaller Azure Stack integrated system for dev test QA. Like, for example, they might have a 4-node system. But then for production, based on an analysis of how many VM workloads or capacity they need, based on scaling that out and calculating the requirements with their OEM, then they may get an 8, 12, or even 16-node system. So that's one way to do that. And then once we have this, so again, this would allow all the administrators to test everything out, and same thing with the developers. So we could test either way, and we can, protect, even in an OEM integrated system, we could do this in its own system, like I said, for a smaller unit, or we could do some testing in a larger scale unit if we wanted to as well, and then just make sure that we have controls and guardrails in place related to RBAC and separation of duties and proper governance, so it doesn't impact anything else before or during that we might have production systems on there. Let's take a look at the Azure Stack Development Kit architecture review. So the development kit hardware requirements, again, if you go to aka.ms/ASDK, there is a link for the requirements. I went through and updated this slide with what is there currently as of creating this recording. So you need to have one OS disk with a minimum of 200 gigabyte available for the system partition, and that's both minimum and recommended. SSD, of course, would be a little bit faster and preferred, but you can use traditional hard disk as well. For disk drives, you have to have 4 disks. Each disk will provide a minimum of 240 gigabyte capacity. This is in the minimum with either SSD, preferred, or HDD, hard disk. Recommended, each disk provides a minimum of 400 gigabyte of capacity. In either case, for the minimum or the recommended, all disks will be used. And if you've seen some other presentations, you will understand exactly why. A quick answer to that is just like in Azure, everything that's created is triple replicated. So when I make a file, there's 3 copies, and so theoretically and logically, that would be spread across 3 disks, or in an Azure Stack integrated system, 3 nodes. And then you always have an extra disk or node for updates, patch, and all that sort of stuff. Now, in the ASDK, our patch and update works entirely different. So it's really not required for that, but in a production system it is. And that's just the way the Azure Stack Fabric works with it. So we start with 4 disks. Just like when we have an Azure Stack Integrate system, we have to have a minimum of 4 nodes. Compute memory. So this has gone up quite a bit from when we first started for a couple reasons. One, the minimum requirement that used to be listed was just really not very useful at all. And 2, we've grown quite a bit in adding capabilities and possibilities with Azure Stack compared to just a couple years ago. So 192 gigabyte of RAM, 256 is better and preferred. So if you're over the 200 gig threshold, you're doing pretty well for an ASDK. For the compute, Hyper-V enabled with SLAT support. For the network NIC, at least Server 2012 R2 certification required for the NIC, otherwise no specialized features. And the hardware is just going to be certified for Server 2012 R2. So on the Harbour considerations, we covered the minimum number of disks with consistent bus type and sizes. So consistency is important. Make sure you got ample available disk space. A simple space is created when you have less than 8 data disks and under 2 terabyte of total space available. So we talked about the minimum requirements, very important, particularly for the additional resource providers. And again, back in the day, a couple years ago, when we first started, as soon as those resource providers came in, that's when it really started choking. So that's why we like to have as much memory as we can do. Only IPv4 addresses are supported at this time. And Azure Stack VPN connections to Azure are not supported through NAT. Some additional networking considerations. So just a single connection is required, requires internet access directly or through a transparent proxy. There are reserved network ranges for infrastructure storage, H&V, external VIP, transit network, and resource endpoints. Those are fixed and defined for you. You need access to a DHCP using a static IP. It requires additional deployment. So the preferred way is to have access to a DHCP server. And we mentioned IPv4 supported. Key differences between the Azure Stack Development Kit and the integrated system is that the BGP NAT virtual machine is deployed. That does not exist in a multi-node system. And there are no switch requirements, unlike an integrated system. All traffic goes through a combination of the host NIC and specific virtual machines. The POC machine itself supports connecting to a switch access port or trunk port. And if you're using a trunk port, or if you need to configure a VLAN ID, you have to provide that VLAN ID as a deployment parameter. So use it wisely. Talking about what it is and is not. We've covered most of these. Let's see what else we can elaborate on. So let's go to the development kit is not. It's not for, we said this briefly, but let's make sure we're really clear. It's not for production hosting of Azure Stack workloads. No scalabilities beyond stated boundaries, so no HA, we've talked about that. And deploying outside the defined configuration scripts, so don't modify the scripts to fit an unsupported configuration. And then we're talking about the deployment scripts that are used for the ASDK. This is just showing a list of the Azure Stack Development Kit components. These are the roles that are building up and creating the Azure Stack Fabric and supporting the whole Azure Stack development kit. A lot of these roles are very similar into what you have for an Azure Stack integrated system. The cool thing on ASDK, you actually can see these. If you open up, for example, dsa.msc for Active Directory users computers, click on computers, and you'll see these objects. You'll see them in Hyper-V. In an Azure Stack integrated system, there's no way you're going to see these without a support call. So they're all hidden under the water, under the hood of the car in an integrated system. But most of the things that are needed from a networking integration standpoint are covered in here. So just briefly touching upon some of these descriptions from the Azure Stack Storage Services. There's an ADFS server in there. There's router and NAT and VPN capabilities, and the BGP NAT role, which we said is included in ASDK, but not in the integrated system. You have to have certificate services. You need a domain controller for things like DNS and DHCP services inside the stack to give it addressing to the servers that are deployed there. The ERCS, we talked about that in another session for accessing the privileged endpoint. And again, note that all these are just one. So if we actually could see these in an Azure Stack integrated system, you're going to have a pair of each of these for redundancy. And in the case of the ERCS, you have 3 of them, as we talked about in another session. Gateway services, network controller for network services, software load balancing, multiplex services, internal data store for Azure Stack infrastructure roles, administration portal, the user portal, and then the XRP, which just does a lot of things for managing compute network storage resource providers. So that one's a really important role, both in Azure Stack Development Kit as well as the integrated system. Let's take a look at the Azure Stack Development Kit deployment tasks, what we have to do to get this thing up and running. So before you do this, once you get your hardware, you can pre-validate your ASDK environment. So there's a deployment checker you can get and download. And that's a great way to check, and it will go through and let you know if everything is going to run properly. And it will check all the disks and the memory and all that sort of stuff. We also have troubleshooting. So on your workstation that you're going to access all this sort of stuff, just like in a production system, you want to make sure you got the Azure Stack PowerShell installed, the Azure Stack tools. I'd recommend the Azure Stack or Storage Explorer. It's not Azure Stack specific, but Storage Explorer for moving files into storage accounts, as well as AZ Copy, which both of those tools will allow multi-threaded support for moving files. So much more efficient than sometimes just trying to bring something into a storage account, which will be single-threaded. So let's take a look at running this by invoking the Azure Stack Deployment Pre-Checker. So you run this from PowerShell. It lets you know about running the scripts. You say yes, and then it says, are you running the script on the host before booting in the provider? And it goes through all the checks. And you see in here it's checking Hyper-V support, domain join, stats, memory, all the basic steps. So download that, make sure you run that before you do the actual deployment. And as long as everything's passed, if not, you fix what hasn't passed, but assuming everything's passed, then we go into the deployment tool. And it's a nice, simple wizard now. It's a much improved experience when we started. So on the left-hand side, we prepare the Cloud Builder VHDX. And that's what's interesting about this, is that the entire setup is all in one VHDX file. So as we mentioned, the patching and updating process is entirely different than an ASD or an Azure Stack integrated system. In an Azure Stack integrated system, patching and updating is a rolling Hyper-V update process where each node is drained, updated, and then it goes on to the next one and the next one and the next node throughout the servers. In this, we don't have multiple nodes. We have one server, and then everything lives within the Hyper-V inside the Cloud Builder VHDX. So it prepares the Cloud Builder VHDX. We put in the middle screen our username and password we're going to use for the administrator. You can give it a name, and then you run the script. It's an automated GUI install, and there's the link at the bottom of the page. Once you've done that, and it's prepared that Cloud Builder VHDX, now we're going to start the installation. So in the installation, we determine what the identity provider is. For the Azure Cloud, you want to use your .onMicrosoft account in Azure Active Directory. Put in the local admin password, and then it tells you it's going to run the script and that you'll get prompted for your Azure AD credentials 2 to 3 minutes after the installation starts. So you want to make sure you have that ready to go. Let's take a look at deployment tasks and toolings and see what else there is that we haven't talked about. This just shows the Azure Stack tools that we referenced, and lots of things in here. We've talked about different parts of these in different sessions on Azure Stack, but things like identity, policies, registration, the compute, admin, connect. So these first scenarios on the right-hand side, in the middle, you see to connect, to add default images, create offers, plans, quotas. All these things can be done through these scripts. Also note that we love feedback, the Microsoft engineering team, and you can provide this through Azure Stack User Voice at any time. You can use that link or just search for Azure Stack User Space and let us know what we need or what we can improve. You can also see, I didn't include the link here, but just remembered I have an aka.ms/Azure Stack Another very useful link is aka.ms/Azure Stack/roadmap. While this is not user voice or feedback, it will let you see the most recent things that have been developed and created, and or things that are coming soon. So for example, looking at multi-stack support across multiple scale units, that's one of the things that's listed there. They can't give exact dates, but it can let you know that it's high in the priority and it's something that's being worked on by engineering. So keep an eye on that, as well as provide feedback in the user voice, and that's always appreciated by us. So administrative tools, we've covered these in other sessions. We've talked about the Azure Stack PowerShell. Again, this is available for Windows, Ubuntu, CentOS, Mac OS X. Visual Studio Code, again, available for Windows, Linux, Mac OS X. A little gotcha when installing Visual Studio with PowerShell tools. Azure PowerShell will be sometimes updated to an unsupported version. So always check the documentation to make sure that you have the correct PowerShell version when you do this. I think lately it's been corrected, but always best to check the documentation. Azure Command Line Interface, or CLI, provides multi-platform management support. And then there's also Azure Stack Command Line Interface Tools installation. But if you follow documentation in the Azure Stack Operator space for installing those tools, it pretty much walks you through step by step all the tools that you want to have and things that we've been talking about throughout this slide. So connecting to Azure Stack, you need to leverage the Azure Stack tools and the Connect module. So, and you need to have the PowerShell installed, and this allows for the creation of a client VPN connection, which is your best experience. The remote clients will support a wider range of Azure's tools, for example, Storage Explorer, AZ Copy, all that sort of stuff. And then using a remote client versus interactive login establishes a better analogous situation to the integrated system through consistency in the client access, because in an Azure Stack integrated system, you're not logging in directly to the integrated system. You're going in through a remote jump box. So that way you have a similar look and feel of how we would do things to an integrated system as well. So development kit first scenarios, really these are Azure Stack integrated scenarios, but in this instance we're testing, kicking the tires of them first. Everything you want to do from, think about when an OEM gets done. As we mentioned, you don't have a lot there. You have compute resource provider, but no images, so we can add a default VM image. You've got network storage and Key Vault, but you got no app services, no SQL services. We don't have any custom RBAC roles created. We just have owner, contributor, reader. Maybe that's good enough, but maybe in the Azure Stack operator space, we want to have separation of duties and practice least privilege, so we could create these custom RBAC roles. We talked about this in another session, but just a reminder, in the RBAC roles, while we have owner, contributor, and reader, we don't have the familiar built-in roles that Azure has. As an example, there is a built-in role for virtual machines. There's a built-in role for network administrator. Those don't exist. We can only do contributor, owner, reader for the entire subscription, for a resource group, or for an individual Azure Stack / Azure resource in the user tenant portal. So on either side of the house, whether we're in the Azure Stack operator and we want to separate out those roles and responsibilities, or we want to help our users, or if we own subscriptions in the tenant / user space, likewise, you could create custom roles in there to do something like just control the network components, or just control storage, or just control virtual machines. So that's a great way to practice that. Whether in Azure or Azure Stack, we can practice it all right in an SDK. You can deploy a gallery item from the marketplace. Figure that out. See what options are available. Create an IaaS offer plan, quotas. Everything we're covering in these sessions. Sign up for a subscription to an offer. Make an offer public. Make it private. Look at logs. Retrieve usage data through the APIs. As an admin, retrieve my tenants' usage. And deploy, operate, and scale modern virtualized cloud applications. So pretty much anything and everything we could do in an Azure Stack integrated system, we can test it out here and make sure it's exactly what we want to do. And it works. As we've talked about throughout a lot of sessions, Azure Stack Quick Start templates, always the best way to go. And take a look at those. And the thing they're showing in the upper right-hand corner, which is pretty cool, is when you're connected and you have internet access, if you go to the very top of the window, you can do it in either the Azure Stack operator or in a user subscription, which I always like to, once I've deployed things like VM images and resource providers, I like to create kind of my own little subscription to pretend like I'm a user. And then I can go in and at the very top of the portal where the search window is, just type the word template and you can do a template deployment. And the thing that's just really magical both about Azure Stack as well as Azure is when we can say, click that little up arrow button and say Quick Start template. When you do this, you're tapping right in directly. You don't have to search for it. It's tapping right into the Azure Stack Quick Start templates. And you have full accessibility. Test them, try them, kick out the tires. If you're new to ARM templates, take a look at how they're all broken down. It's a great way to learn, great way to test, great way to deploy. So getting started, there is a great document, and I've put that and some more in building an end-to-end validation environment ebook. It was done by a lot of brilliant minds at Microsoft. You absolutely want to take a look at this. So in one of my recent blogs, I put that, and I'm going to show some other things here at aka.ms/ and this is all one word, Azure Stack links. I want to make it as simple as possible. So you see right here, we have the end-to-end validation. But another series, what I really want to highlight is some good stuff here. And there were, what have I got here? 10 parts of, and these are outside of the normal Azure Stack documents, but a lot of smart guys in the engineering and the product group put together these 10-part series related to Azure Stack IaaS. Getting into core infrastructure as a services, start with what you have, look at migration considerations, partner and Microsoft options, foundations, looking at resilience to failure, hardening by default standards, and tuning VMs. Part 4, backup disaster recovery. That's from our program manager for the backup recovery solutions. Do it yourself, deployment, daily operations, support and troubleshooting, pay for what you use, resizing VMs, resizing disk, usage-based pricing. Part 7 takes a team, so everything from identity and single sign-on, role-based access, service principal, foreign principals, activity logs, locks and tags. Part 8, if you do it often, automate it, so a little bit more about templates, Visual Studio Code, PowerShell, and CLI. Part 9, things that we've talked about, but more references about Azure Marketplace, quick start templates and documentation. And 10, the journey to PaaS. Really, really good stuff. I could never find them all exactly in order, so that's why I just put them all in order with a little description here, as well as that building end-to-end validation environment. And I'll probably be adding some more links in here later on. So good stuff. You want to get that free ebook for you, go grab it. Account considerations. So depending if you're using Azure Active Directory or ADFS, so you got the root administrator account, which we saw when we set up. That's the ASDK host administrator. Same rights as an Azure Active Directory for ADFS. The Azure Stack / Azure Stack admin. You can use that to log in the Azure Stack portal. That's the ASDK host administrator, and access to view an administrative service fabric ring. So this is where you get under the hood of the car that you can't do in the integrated system. The Azure Stack / cloud admin, again, that is separate rights from the Azure Stack admin that gets you into that privileged endpoint, and they can get kind of deep into things. So practice that, learn that, and use that in the ASDK before you have to do it. And you're trying to figure things out in the Azure Stack integrated system. Azure Active Directory Global Admin Installation Account. So this is always needed during installation, and also whenever you're installing any kind of core resource provider. So if you're a smaller shop, you may be all of the above. If you're a larger shop, where I've worked in some customers, the Azure Stack operators were one group, we had AD operators another group, and we had someone else who had all the Azure subscription and Azure Active Directory Global Admin account, and we had to say, Mother, may I? Can we please come over? And they would not give us that username and password, but they would come over and visit whenever we needed that. So you got to be friends with those folks. So start planning your workloads now, re-envision existing applications, re-envision with your customers, and show them the possibilities. And if they already have Azure, look at the possibilities for hybrid applications that will span both across Azure and Azure Stack. And then practice these, do these in the ASDK to modernize. A common theme I talk to my customers about is modernizing applications and modernizing authentication protocols for identity, because we say identity is the new security boundary. We want to protect our customers' environments as well as our own in these cloud environments. Okay. Updates. So we've talked about the patch and update process. Every ASDK requires a complete redeployment based on the way it is. So make sure if you have any kind of development workloads or deployment workloads in their dev tests that you back up that data in particular. If you had scripts to run this, use infrastructure as code artifacts, your ARM templates, and make sure you save all that. And then there's a documentation at the bottom there for redeploying. So some other quick points about ASDK Lifecycle Management. It's a living deployment, so you need to keep it up to date. If you keep one around for a while, there could be domain password expiration, Azure Active Directory password expiration, which you would do in the Azure portal. Resource provider updates. So again, this is a good place to practice them in your ASDK before you roll those out into the Azure Stack integrated system. And then likewise with the ASDK platform updates, as we talked about as well. There you go. That's all we... There you go. That concludes another session on Azure Stack, looking at the Azure Stack Development Kit. We hope this information is useful to you. Please leverage the shortcuts provided. And we want to thank you very much for your time and have a great day. This is Mark Grimes from Microsoft. Goodbye.